Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into a drawing room where candlelight catches on brass fixtures and heavy drapes, where a woman adjusts her shawl one more time before facing her reflection. The year is 1856. Gas lamps cast shadows across papered walls, and underneath yards of silk and boning something grows that polite society has decided must stay hidden as long as physically possible. She's 6 months along, and tonight she'll take tea with the ladies as though everything remains exactly as it was. Because in Victorian England, pregnancy wasn't something to announce or celebrate. It was a situation to be managed, concealed, and most importantly, kept from public view. You probably couldn't handle this, not just the restrictive clothing, though that alone would challenge you, but the sheer exhausting act of pretending your body wasn't engaged in the most fundamental human experience while everyone around you participated in the same pretense. The careful wordplay, the physical strain, the silent agreement that everyone understood what was happening and yet nobody would dare speak it aloud. So before we go further, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely interested in what I create here, and tell me where you're listening from. What time is it in your world right now? I'm always curious who's out there, maybe curled up in bed in Singapore or Adelaide or some small town in Sweden where frost covers the windows as you settle in. Now, lower the lights, let your breath slow down, and picture yourself entering that candlelit room where truth hides behind propriety and silence carries more meaning than speech. The corset wasn't simply an undergarment. You have to grasp this right from the beginning. It was structure. It was philosophy sewn into fabric and whalebone. The Victorian corset moulded women into perfection. The S-bend, the compressed waist, the elevated bust that had nothing to do with ease and everything to do with discipline. And when a woman conceived, the corset transformed into something else altogether, an instrument of disguise. You observe as the lady's maid works the lacings, her movements efficient and practiced. The woman, we'll call her Catherine because she deserves identity, holds onto the bed frame and breathes out slowly. The constriction around her middle is substantial, but she's been wearing corsets since she was 13. Her body understands this vocabulary. What her body hasn't learned is how to reconcile the expanding life within her against the rigid demands without. Here's the fascinating part historians often highlight. There were actually specialized maternity corsets. They sound contradictory, and in many respects, they were. These particular garments included adjustable sections, additional lacing, and carefully placed boning that could be relaxed as the months advanced. Some featured hinged panels. Others incorporated elastic strips, a fairly innovative material for that period. The goal wasn't to abandon the corset during pregnancy, but to modify it, because abandoning a corset entirely was simply inconceivable for a woman of standing. The accepted historical understanding is that medical professionals of the time held sharply different opinions. Some doctors cautioned that tight corseting during pregnancy could result in miscarriage, birth defects, or maternal injury. They distributed literature, they gave speeches, they were mostly disregarded. Other doctors, and this is where matters become complicated, maintained that reasonable corseting actually supported the spine and belly, offering relief rather than risk. Historians continue debating whether most Victorian women genuinely tight-laced throughout pregnancy, or whether the practice was overstated by critics eager to condemn the corset wholesale. The reality, as usual, probably exists somewhere between extremes, shifting dramatically based on social class, geography, and personal preference. But why conceal it at all? You might be asking this as you watch Catherine finally let go of the bed frame, her waist now a societally approved 21 inches. The explanation is wrapped up in Victorian propriety, much like thread around a bobbin. Pregnancy was evidence of sexual relations, yes, even within marriage, even when the entire point of marriage, according to Victorian thinking, was the creation of legitimate children. The pregnant form was a visible testament that a woman had engaged in that act. The act that respectable people didn't discuss, didn't reference, didn't recognise. In proper company, the smell of burning coal drifts across the room as the maid assists Catherine into her evening gown. It's a deep emerald velvet, selected deliberately because darker shades are more accommodating. The bodice is designed to pull attention upward toward the high collar and the simple cameo brooch. The skirt is voluminous, held up by a cage crinoline that could conceal a substantial secret, much less a 6-month pregnancy. Catherine looks elegant. She looks proper. She looks like someone with nothing whatsoever to hide. You sense the burden of all this as you stand in the shadows, unseen, watching. The fireplace glows warmly. Downstairs somewhere, household staff are readying the coach, and Catherine is doing what innumerable Victorian women did. She's acting ordinary while her body quietly resists the acting. There's a strange contradiction here, and it deserves consideration. The Victorians revered motherhood. They romanticised it in artwork, in literature, in the very design of their homes, with nurseries positioned on upper floors like sanctuaries. Yet the journey of becoming a mother, the pregnancy phase itself, was handled as something embarrassing, something to be weathered privately and only revealed when decent. Mothers were celebrated. Pregnant women were concealed. You watch Catherine examine her appearance one last time. Her hand moves almost unconsciously toward her midsection, a motion so quick you could easily miss it. Then her face settles into the calm expression that society demands, and she moves toward the doorway. The evening calls. The act goes on, and you accompany her, leaving the bedroom and entering a realm where the most ordinary thing imaginable had to be wrapped in whalebone and secrecy. The coach jolts over stone streets, and you sink into the dimness beside Catherine, feeling the vibrations travel through the cushioned seat and into your frame. Beyond the windows, London unfolds in pieces. A flash of street lighting, the outline of a chimney, the far-off rattle of another coach headed towards something equally formal and equally meaningless. Catherine sits absolutely motionless, her gloved hands resting in her lap, her breathing limited beneath the corset's hold. She will go to this gathering. She will converse and appear pleasant and eat modestly, and then, within weeks, she will disappear. This is the custom of withdrawal, and you're about to see its peculiar reasoning take shape. The term itself reveals everything. Confinement. Not respite, not readiness. Confinement. As though pregnancy were a punishment to be completed, a separation to be survived. And in numerous ways, that's precisely how Victorian culture approached it. Once a woman's condition became impossible to disguise, typically around the 6th or 7th month, depending on her clothing choices and her natural build, she was expected to remove herself from public existence completely. No more social events, no more visiting, no more presence at worship services, at performances, at any occasion where respectable individuals might observe her and be faced with the troubling proof of her situation. You exit the coach with Catherine, but you already understand this is among her final nights of participation. The residence glows invitingly, and conversation flows from the lit windows. Inside you detect roasted fowl and the sharp fragrance of wine. Candles flicker in ornate fixtures, throwing moving patterns across fabric-covered walls. Catherine is welcomed by the hostess, and you notice the subtle exchange, the way glances drop downward for just an instant, evaluating, measuring, before returning to Catherine's face with rehearsed warmth. Everyone understands. Nobody utters a word. Here's an interesting point that historians often emphasize. The protocols of confinement weren't legally mandated, but they functioned like law. They were maintained through whispered judgment, through social rejection, through the gradual cessation of invitations. A woman who showed herself publicly while obviously pregnant risked being deemed crude, brazen, or, most damaging of all, lower class. The nobility and the climbing middle ranks enforced these boundaries mercilessly, because reputation was wealth and pregnancy was a liability that required payment. During seclusion, the established historical understanding is that confinement could extend anywhere from 1 to 3 months preceding the birth, and then an extra month or longer afterward for what was termed the lying-in phase. This meant a woman might vanish from society for 4 months or beyond. Her acquaintances would be aware, naturally. Her relatives would come discreetly through rear entrances and private parlours, but to the broader community, she simply stopped existing until she re-emerged slender and restored, with an infant that had seemingly appeared from nowhere. You follow Catherine into the dining area, where the table shines with silver and glassware. The talk moves around you. Current affairs, the newest publication, a shocking story about somebody's relative. Catherine participates just enough to appear interested, but you observe her vitality is carefully distributed, measured out in exact portions. Creating a human being is draining labour. Doing it while acting as though you're not is something altogether different. The fire in the dining room hearth snaps and shifts, releasing a quick spray of embers towards the flue. You catch the scent of tallow candles blending with the heavy smell of mutton and the slight mustiness of aged fabric. Across the arrangement, a gentleman is expounding on the significance of moral fibre in educating young boys. He has no awareness that 3 of the ladies at this table are keeping identical secrets, each at varying stages, each calculating the days until they can retreat behind locked doors. Historians continue discussing the mental cost of confinement. Some researchers propose that many women appreciated the break, the justification to step back from the relentless social demands of Victorian existence. Others reference correspondence and journals that show a contrasting picture: loneliness, tedium, worry, and a growing feeling of being deleted. The reality is likely both, varying by the individual, her circumstances, and her network of support. But what's certain is that confinement imposed a form of social erasure, a brief but complete extraction from the realm of the active. You consider this as the final course arrives, a shivering pudding and a plate of candied fruits. Catherine accepts a modest serving, conscious of the corset, conscious of all things. Within weeks, her universe will contract to the dimensions of a single chamber. The drapes will be pulled, the callers will be filtered, and she will exist in the odd suspension between who she was and who she is transforming into. The coach journey homeward is more subdued. Catherine rests her head against the glass, and you hear her exhale, a sound so faint it could have been the groan of the coach frame. The roads are emptier at this hour, the street lamps making pools of amber brightness on damp stones. Somewhere a hound bays, somewhere a gate shuts. The metropolis is sliding toward rest, and Catherine is sliding toward something else, the gradual, unavoidable arrival of her confinement. Back at the residence, the maid assists her with undressing, and you observe the corset being removed, like protective gear being shed after combat. Catherine's palm finds her belly, and this time the motion stays. She is permitted this in privacy. She is permitted to acknowledge in the darkness of her own chamber that her body is accomplishing something extraordinary. But tomorrow she will bind up again, and the day following that, until the day ultimately arrives when no quantity of whalebone and dark cloth can mask the truth. Then the curtains will draw, the invitations will cease, and Catherine will commence her confinement properly, tucked away like a secret too scandalous to voice, even though everyone already comprehends. You settle into the corner of her chamber, watching the candles sputter and expire. The scent of extinguished wick floats through the space, and you grasp, perhaps for the first time, that Victorian pregnancy wasn't merely a physical passage. It was an intricate, vanishing performance, staged for an audience that required invisibility as the cost of standing. The darkness thickens. Catherine rests, and you remain, understanding that soon the genuine concealment will commence. Daybreak seeps through embroidered curtains, tentative and uncertain, as though even sunlight recognizes better than to be too assertive in a Victorian home. You find yourself in a breakfast chamber where tea is being served and bread is being spread, and the discussion is circling around a topic that everyone grasps, but nobody will identify. Catherine's mother-in-law has arrived to visit, and she is asking about Catherine's condition with the sort of pointed delicacy that could slice through steel. You appear somewhat pale, dear. Perhaps you've been overextending yourself. I am perfectly fine. I appreciate your concern. Perhaps a bit of weariness. Weariness? Indeed, well, one must recuperate when one is weary. And there it is, the hesitation, the significant look, the entire exchange conducted in cipher, as though speaking clearly might invoke some dreadful outcome. You are observing the complex linguistic ballet that Victorians mastered when addressing pregnancy, a performance of indirection so elaborate it would leave a negotiator speechless with respect. The word pregnant was inappropriate. Let that register for a moment. A term describing a completely ordinary biological function experienced by countless women across history was deemed too coarse for refined discussion. The Victorians, who could address mortality and illness and financial collapse with relative ease, established boundaries at acknowledging that women carried infants within their bodies. The entire situation would be amusing if it weren't so draining. So they created substitutes, scores of them. You might learn that a woman was in a delicate state or in a family way. She might be expecting or anticipating a blessed event. She could be enceinte, adopting from French because somehow it seemed more cultured in another tongue. She was with child, which at least carried scriptural authority, or in an interesting situation, which makes pregnancy sound like a mildly curious puzzle instead of a profound physical metamorphosis. Here's a fascinating detail that historians frequently note. Even the term confinement was viewed as more acceptable than pregnancy, because it emphasized the retreat from society instead of the biological fact. The vocabulary itself enacted a kind of deletion, transforming the pregnant woman into a passive subject, characterized by her withdrawal rather than her presence. She wasn't nurturing a human being, she was simply indisposed. You watch Catherine maneuver this linguistic obstacle course with practiced skill. When her mother-in-law inquires whether the nursery arrangements are advancing satisfactorily, Catherine replies that preparations are being made for all contingencies. When a visiting companion asks about her digestion, Catherine confesses to particular sensitivities that are typical in her current state. The current state, as though pregnancy were a temporary mailing address instead of a fundamental alteration of her body and her existence. The fire crackles in the hearth, and you smell the recognizable combination of coal smoke and toast. A servant glides silently across the room, refilling teacups, her expression deliberately neutral. She comprehends naturally. The entire household comprehends. But the performance must persist, even among familiars, because the habit of euphemism penetrates so deeply it has become instinctive. The verified historical understanding is that the restriction around pregnancy vocabulary reached far beyond informal discussion. Newspapers covering royal births would employ the most indirect language conceivable. Medical volumes written for general readership would qualify and soften. Even confidential correspondence between intimate friends frequently depended on coded speech, as though the written word might be discovered by the propriety authorities. The historian Sarah Stage has traced how this linguistic evasion continued well into the 20th century in certain circles, a persistent legacy from the Victorian period. Historians continue disputing whether this linguistic refinement reflected authentic unease with female sexuality, or whether it was chiefly a status indicator, a method for the respectable to separate themselves from the common masses who spoke directly about bodies and babies. Some researchers argue that working-class women had far less tolerance for such pretense, that the euphemism phenomenon was predominantly a middle and upper-class condition. Others observe that the restriction filtered downward through society as ambitious households adopted the speaking patterns of their social superiors, hoping to ascend the hierarchy. The reality, as usual, is likely tangled and intricate and impossible to define with certainty. But you notice something additional as you observe Catherine and her mother-in-law. The euphemisms aren't solely about preventing vulgarity. They're about preserving authority. By declining to name the situation directly, the Victorians maintained pregnancy in a sort of linguistic isolation. Present but unrecognised, significant but restricted. The pregnant woman existed in a grammatical void defined by what couldn't be spoken about her instead of what could. The morning extends. Additional tea is served. The mother-in-law eventually departs, squeezing Catherine's hand, with a purposeful pressure that transmits everything words are prohibited from expressing. You accompany Catherine to her private sitting area, where she finally permits herself to collapse into a chair and close her eyes. The room is still except for the rhythm of a timepiece on the shelf and the remote sounds of the household continuing its routines. You smell lavender. There's a packet placed among the pillows, and the faint staleness of a space that doesn't receive sufficient ventilation. Catherine's hand settles on her belly, concealed beneath the layers of her morning gown. In this private instance, she doesn't require euphemisms. Her body communicates plainly enough. But even here, even solitary, you detect the pressure of all those unuttered words bearing down on her. The Victorians constructed an entire lexicon of avoidance, and it requires effort to step beyond it, even in the privacy of your own thoughts. To be pregnant was to be unmentionable, and to be unmentionable was to be, in some essential way, invisible, even to oneself. A maid taps gently at the entrance, reporting that the seamstress has come for a fitting. Catherine sighs and stands, smoothing her garments. The fitting will entail precise measurements and understanding glances and absolutely no direct reference to why the dress requires expansion at the waist. The performance proceeds, word by unuttered word. You follow her forward, astonished at the sheer effort demanded to sustain this elaborate fiction. And you start to comprehend that Victorian pregnancy wasn't only hidden by corsets and drawn curtains. It was hidden by language itself, interred under strata of courteous evasion, as though words possessed the ability to make inconvenient realities vanish. The seamstress's pins capture the light as she labours. Small silver glints against the dark material of Catherine's afternoon gown. You stand in the corner of the fitting chamber, observing this careful negotiation develop. The seamstress is an expert. She has performed this countless times. Her hands understand precisely where to add space, where to fashion strategic folds, where to position a decorative ribbon that pulls the gaze upward and away. And throughout it all, neither woman recognizes what they are genuinely accomplishing. They are partners in a mutual pretense, and the pretense requires silence. But why? You've been examining this question since we started, and now it's time to confront directly the centre of Victorian unease. The pregnant body wasn't merely awkward or uncomfortable. It was, in the perception of proper society, authentically threatening. A moral danger that risked contaminating refined company with the troubling reality of female sexuality. You need to comprehend the reasoning. Distorted as it is, the Victorians built an elaborate mythology surrounding feminine innocence. The perfect woman was an angel at home, pure, passionless, committed to household and family. She was a moral protector, a refining force on the cruder impulses of men. She yielded to her husband's requirements from obligation, not desire, and she definitely didn't derive pleasure from it. This was the authorized narrative, the public account that controlled everything from dress to decoration to the manner women were instructed. And then pregnancy appeared and destroyed everything, because pregnancy was evidence, irrefutable, observable, expanding evidence that a woman had participated in sexual union. It was irrelevant that she was wed. It was irrelevant that bearing children was literally her most critical social role. The pregnant body was a moving testament that the angel at home had done something decidedly unangelic, and refined society didn't know where to direct its attention. Here's an intriguing detail that historians frequently mention. Certain Victorian etiquette manuals actually recommended pregnant women avoid appearing before unwed young women, lest the sight stimulate unwholesome interest or indelicate inquiries. The pregnant body was handled as a form of sexual instruction that proper girls shouldn't encounter, as though observing a woman in an advanced condition might damage their purity by causing them to question how infants were genuinely created. The entire matter has a somewhat frantic quality to it, like a culture frantically attempting to restrain the ocean with a teacup. The seamstress completes her modifications and retreats to evaluate her labour. Catherine rotates slowly before the looking glass, and you observe the outcome. A garment that implies nothing, discloses nothing, preserves the illusion of an unaltered figure. The woman in the reflection could be anyone. She is proper, she is modest. She is invisible in the manner that Victorian society required. The confirmed historical understanding is that the moral alarm surrounding visible pregnancy was profoundly connected with concerns about class and social structure. The middle ranks especially were fixated on separating themselves from the labouring poor, who possessed neither the means nor the desire to conceal their pregnancies behind expensive maternity clothing and months of private seclusion. A visible pregnancy identified you as common, as vulgar, as someone who couldn't afford the elaborate performance of respectability. And in a culture where standing was everything, that kind of identification could be devastating. You smell the seamstress's needle holder, a slight trace of metal and aged fabric as she collects her implements. The fire in the fitting chamber has diminished, and the afternoon brightness is fading toward grey. Catherine thanks her with the remote courtesy that characterises all exchanges with merchants, and you follow her back to the sitting area, where tea is prepared and the timepiece on the mantel continues its patient marking. But your mind keeps returning to that expression, unwholesome interest. The Victorians were frightened of questions. They were frightened of women, particularly young women, thinking too carefully about their own forms, their own futures, their own sexuality. The pregnant woman represented a rupture in the barrier of ignorance that proper society had erected around feminine innocence. She was a fissure through which dangerous understanding might penetrate. Historians continue arguing about how extensively ordinary Victorian women actually absorbed these attitudes versus merely performing them for social survival. Some scholars indicate private writings and correspondence that disclose a far more pragmatic, even earthy attitude toward pregnancy among women who had no audience to perform for. Others propose that the shame and concern were authentic, that generations of moral instruction had accomplished their task on women's minds. The reality probably fluctuated enormously, by individual, by class, by region, by the specific arrangement of beliefs and experiences that formed each woman's internal realm. Catherine sits beside the window, her tea cooling, her attention fixed on the road below. A nursemaid passes with a baby carriage, and you watch Catherine's eyes track the carriage until it vanishes around the bend. In several months, that will be her existence, or rather her child's existence, overseen by servants while Catherine recovers and eventually returns to society. The infant will be observable, the mother will be presentable, and the pregnancy that bridged one condition to the other will be forgotten, erased, as though it never occurred. The brightness continues to diminish. You hear the far-off clatter of a coach, the call of a street merchant selling something you can't quite determine. The metropolis continues its business, filled with women in different stages of visibility and invisibility, each navigating the same impossible expectations in her own manner. You think about the expression moral danger and how peculiar it is to apply it to pregnancy, to the very mechanism by which humanity persists. But that's the Victorian brilliance, if you can term it that. They took the most ordinary thing in existence and wrapped it in so many strata of shame and silence that it became nearly unrecognisable. The pregnant woman wasn't honoured. She wasn't even accepted. She was a difficulty to be addressed, a scandal to be contained. A body that had violated the myth of feminine innocence simply by accomplishing what bodies accomplish. Catherine finishes her tea finally, cold as it is, and signals for the maid. Tomorrow involves more fittings, more careful modifications, more performances of ordinariness. The moral alarm around her body won't diminish until her body is no longer observable, secured away in confinement where respectable people don't have to face what it signifies, and you sit with her in the accumulating twilight, sharing the burden of all that invisible criticism, all that unspoken fear, all that frantic need to pretend that angels don't possess bodies whatsoever. The wardrobe stands open like a revelation, and you find yourself examining its contents alongside Catherine and her maid. Silk and wool and linen hang in organised rows, each piece a tool in the continuing battle against visibility. The maid retrieves a day dress with a comprehending expression, and you notice immediately what distinguishes it. The seams at the waist are constructed to be expanded, the bodice tailored with intentional looseness, the design a dark floral that deceives the eye and forgives the shape. This is maternity clothing, Victorian fashion, and it is a work of strategic genius. Fashion, you are discovering, was never merely about aesthetics. In the 19th century, it was about tactics, and for pregnant women, it was about continuation. The crinoline was a pregnant woman's greatest ally, though it was never promoted that way. You've encountered them already, those massive cage structures made of steel rings and coarse hair that upheld the enormous skirts of mid-Victorian style. They were ridiculed, lampooned, and sometimes ignited by careless women standing too near fireplaces. But for a woman attempting to disguise a growing middle, the crinoline was a blessing. Its sheer magnitude meant that the form beneath became practically irrelevant. You could be 5 months along, under a properly built crinoline, and nobody would suspect. Here's a captivating detail that historians frequently highlight. Fashion illustrations from the 1850s and 60s depict pregnant women virtually never. But the designs themselves reveal a different account. The extreme breadth of skirts, the elevated waistlines that fluctuated, the tactical deployment of oversized decorations and ornamental overlays. All of these characteristics served dual functions, permitting women to sustain fashionable presentations while accommodating the actualities of frequent pregnancy. Victorian women, after all, commonly spent the majority of their reproductive years either pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. Fashion had to accommodate, even if nobody would confess why. The maid assists Catherine into a morning gown with an empire waist, a fashion that positions the seam directly under the bust, allowing the material to drape loosely over the midsection. You recognise this silhouette from previous periods, from Regency style, and you understand that pregnant women in every generation have discovered the same fundamental truth. If you cannot conceal the belly, elevate the waistline above it. You step into the wardrobe room and the smell hits you immediately. Lavender sachets tucked between folded linens, cedar wood lining the drawers, and underneath it all the faint mustiness of fabric that's been stored too long. The maid is already at work, pulling dresses from their hooks with practiced efficiency, assessing each one with the kind of expertise that comes from years of managing other people's secrets. She knows exactly which seams can be let out, which bodices can be loosened, which garments will buy Eleanor another week or two of acceptable public presence. By the 1850s, the empire waist had officially fallen out of fashion, but it lingered in what the Victorians called undress garments, the loose, comfortable clothing women wore at home when no one important was watching. Comfort was always permitted as long as it stayed private, hidden behind closed doors where it couldn't offend anyone's sense of propriety. And now those outdated styles were being resurrected for a very specific purpose, pressed back into service because their generous cut could conceal what polite society refused to acknowledge. There was actually a small industry devoted to serving pregnant women, though it operated in whispers and euphemisms. Dressmakers advertised adjustable waists and expanding bodices without ever stating why anyone might need such features. Catalogues offered tea gowns and ladies' wrappers that just happened to provide extra room through the midsection. The entire enterprise was conducted with elaborate discretion, everyone understanding the unspoken purpose while maintaining the fiction that pregnancy simply didn't exist in respectable circles. Eleanor stands before the full-length mirror, and you watch her practice the art of misdirection. She pins a brooch at her throat, drawing attention upward. She drapes a shawl across her shoulders, adding layers of visual confusion. The maid suggests a more elaborate hairstyle, something that will catch the eye, and Eleanor agrees immediately. Every element of her appearance is calibrated to direct the gaze away from what cannot be mentioned. It's exhausting to witness, and impressive in equal measure. But fashion has its limits. Even the most skillful draping and the fullest crinolines will eventually fail to do their job. You can see Eleanor thinking about this as she practices walking in her altered dress, her movements deliberate and careful. She's buying time, perhaps a few more weeks before the inevitable retreat into complete seclusion. Each day she manages to maintain the illusion is another day she remains connected to the larger world, another day before the walls close in completely. There's still debate among historians about how much genuine choice Victorian women had in these matters. Some scholars emphasize the creativity and resourcefulness women showed in navigating impossible expectations, finding ways to assert agency within brutal constraints. Others argue that the entire system was designed to control women's bodies, and any choice made within that framework was hardly a choice at all. The truth probably lives somewhere between these positions. Women making the best decisions available to them within a structure they had no power to change or escape. The afternoon light shifts as the fitting session winds down. The maid begins returning garments to their proper places, the rejected options set aside for further alteration or storage. You follow Eleanor to the window where she looks down at the street below, her expression carrying that particular quality you're starting to recognize. A kind of wistful calculation, measuring how much longer she can participate in the life that continues beyond these walls. A carriage passes carrying a woman in an elaborate feathered hat. Two gentlemen walk by engaged in animated conversation. A flower seller arranges her cart on the corner, bright blooms providing the only colour in an otherwise grey London afternoon. All of this will go on without Eleanor. Once her confinement begins, the city won't pause or slow. It will simply edit her out of the picture, smoothly and completely, as if she were never part of it at all. You think about camouflage in nature, the way certain animals blend seamlessly into their surroundings for survival. Victorian maternity fashion was its own form of camouflage, a way of becoming invisible while remaining in plain sight. The pregnant woman didn't just hide behind walls and drawn curtains. She hid behind fabric and structure and careful manipulation of where people looked. She made herself disappear, one outfit at a time, until even that wasn't enough and she had to vanish entirely. The fire needs attention and the maid steps out to call for more coal. Eleanor stays at the window, her hand resting lightly against the glass, her reflection ghostly in the fading afternoon light. Inside her, the baby moves. You see her register it, a small sharp breath, a flicker of something in her eyes. But the moment passes quickly and her expression smooths over. Some secrets are easier to keep than others. You stand beside her watching London conduct its business, thinking about all the invisible women concealed inside their carefully constructed dresses, counting down the days until even fashion can't protect them anymore. The room is darker than you anticipated. You step through the doorway and feel everything shift. The air is heavier here, thicker somehow. A hush settles over you like dust accumulating on furniture no one touches anymore. This is the lying-in room, and it's being prepared for Eleanor's confinement. The curtains are thick velvet, drawn tight against the afternoon sun. Every window is closed and sealed. The carpet absorbs your footsteps completely, and the walls seem designed to swallow sound, creating a space that exists outside normal time. Servants move through the room with quiet purpose. A bed is being made up with fresh linens, the sheets crisp and white, the pillows beaten into submission. A washstand is positioned carefully in the corner, basin and pitcher gleaming dully in the low light. A small table holds an array of mysterious bottles and jars, remedies and tonics that will be administered when the moment comes. Everything is arranged with the precision of ritual, because that's exactly what this is. The lying-in room is a kind of temple, and Eleanor will be its reluctant priestess. The smell reaches you first. Beeswax and furniture polish, dried lavender and something else, something medicinal and sharp that you can't quite place. The Victorians believed fresh air was dangerous to pregnant women and new mothers, that open windows invited disease and ill humours into vulnerable bodies. So the lying-in room was sealed tight, the air kept still and warm, the outside world held firmly at bay. It must have been suffocating. It must have felt like being entombed alive. There's a curious historical detail worth noting. The tradition of darkening the lying-in room stretched back centuries, but the Victorians turned it into high art. Some medical authorities recommended keeping the room so dark that candles were necessary even at midday. Others insisted that red curtains were preferable to any other colour, claiming red light prevented scarring from various infections. The science was complete nonsense, but the ritual persisted, wrapping childbirth in shadows both literal and metaphorical. You move deeper into the room, your eyes slowly adjusting to the dimness. The bed dominates everything, a massive four-poster hung with heavy drapes that can be drawn closed, creating a room within a room. Eleanor will spend weeks in this bed, before the birth, during it, and for the long recovery afterward. She'll eat here, sleep here, receive her carefully screened visitors here. The bed will become her entire world, and everything beyond it will fade into rumour and distant memory. Victorian medical authorities took the lying-in period extremely seriously. Women were expected to remain in bed for at least 2 weeks after giving birth, often much longer. A month was common. 6 weeks wasn't unusual for women with means. The reasoning was that the body needed complete rest to recover from the trauma of childbirth, and any exertion might cause permanent damage. Walking too soon, climbing stairs too soon, even sitting up too soon. All of these were believed to risk prolapse, hemorrhage, or worse, so women lay in their darkened rooms and waited for permission to rejoin the living. The housekeeper enters carrying a final armload of supplies, extra blankets, a small bell Eleanor can ring for assistance, a collection of cloths whose purpose you prefer not to examine too closely. She surveys the room with a critical eye, checking every detail, making sure nothing has been overlooked. This is her domain now, and she'll guard it fiercely. Once Eleanor enters confinement, the housekeeper will control who comes and goes, what news reaches the patient, what disturbances are permitted. It's a small kingdom, and she is its absolute ruler. The silence presses down on you like a physical weight. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks, but even that sound seems muffled, as if time itself moves differently in this space. The fire in the grate burns low, throwing flickering shadows across the ceiling. You think about Eleanor somewhere else in the house, going about her remaining days of freedom, and you wonder what it must feel like to know this room is waiting, this quiet, airless chamber where she'll face the most dangerous moment of her life. Historians still debate the psychological effects of extended lying-in periods. Some scholars suggest the enforced rest may have actually helped prevent postpartum complications. giving women's bodies genuine time to heal. Others point to the isolation, the darkness, the lack of stimulation as likely contributors to what we'd now call postpartum depression. Victorian medical literature contains numerous references to women who became melancholic or hysterical during their confinement, though the causes were rarely understood and the treatments often made things worse. The lying-in room was meant to be a sanctuary, but it could just as easily become a prison. The housekeeper finishes her inspection and withdraws, closing the door with a soft click. You're alone in the room now, surrounded by shadows and silence. The bed looms before you, its white linens almost luminous in the dimness. You reach out and touch the fabric, cool and smooth under your fingertips, and you imagine Eleanor lying here in the coming weeks, her body doing its ancient work while the world outside continues without her. The sealed windows, the drawn curtains, the muffled sounds. It all makes a terrible kind of sense when you think about it. The Victorians wanted pregnancy invisible, and the lying-in room was the final stage of that disappearance. Here, behind locked doors and heavy drapes, the messy reality of childbirth could unfold without offending anyone's sensibilities. The screams would be absorbed by thick walls. The blood would be contained by white sheets. And when it was over, the woman would emerge pale and weakened but presentable, as if nothing particularly remarkable had happened at all. You stand in the darkness a moment longer, listening to the silence, breathing the stale air. Somewhere in the house a door closes, somewhere a servant laughs and is quickly hushed. Life continues as it always does, while this room waits with patient inevitability. The lying-in room is ready, and soon, whether she's ready or not, Eleanor will come. The back stairs creak under your feet as you follow a housemaid carrying a tray of broth and dry toast. You're descending into the hidden architecture of a Victorian household. The servants' passages, the concealed doorways, the network of corridors that allowed the domestic machinery to operate without ever being visible to the family it served. You're beginning to understand that Eleanor's pregnancy isn't just her secret to keep. It belongs to everyone in this house, held in trust by dozens of hands that will never be acknowledged. The kitchen is warm and loud after the hush of the lying-in room. Copper pots gleam on hooks above the enormous cast-iron range. The cook is shouting instructions to a scullery maid. The smell of roasting meat mingles with sharper scents of onion and fresh bread. You press yourself against the wall as servants bustle past, each one focused on their particular task, each one carrying a small piece of the household's elaborate fiction. Here's what you need to understand. In any Victorian home of size, servants knew everything. They emptied the chamber pots, they laundered the sheets, they carried the trays and lit the fires and stood silently in corners while their employers discussed supposedly private matters. A lady's maid would know about a pregnancy before the lady herself was certain. She was the one tracking the laundering of intimate garments after all. And yet this knowledge was wrapped in impenetrable silence, a conspiracy of discretion that was as much a part of the job as polishing silver or answering doors. You watch Eleanor's lady's maid prepare a special tisane in the corner of the kitchen, measuring dried herbs with practiced hands. Raspberry leaf, you think, and perhaps some chamomile. Remedies passed down through generations of women who served other women. Knowledge that existed outside medical textbooks and physicians' recommendations. The maid works quickly, her face revealing nothing, though she's known about Eleanor's condition for months now. She was the first to know, actually, before Eleanor's husband, before the physician, before anyone. She noticed the changes in Eleanor's body before Eleanor herself fully grasped what they meant. The relationship between a Victorian lady and her personal maid was one of the most intimate in the household, often spanning decades. The maid dressed and undressed her mistress, managed her wardrobe, styled her hair, witnessed her in moments of complete vulnerability. She knew secrets that would never be spoken aloud in drawing rooms, not just pregnancies, but illnesses, marital difficulties, private griefs. And she was expected to carry all of this knowledge to her grave. Her discretion was the foundation upon which her employment rested, You follow the tisane as it makes its journey upstairs, carried on a silver tray by a junior housemaid who's been carefully coached on proper procedure. Knock twice. Wait for acknowledgement. Enter with eyes downcast. Place the tray on the designated table. Withdraw without speaking unless spoken to. The choreography is as precise as any ballet, and its purpose is the same: to create an illusion, to make the mechanics of service invisible, so the family can maintain their fiction of effortless gentility. But the servants talk among themselves. Of course they do. In the kitchen, in the servants' hall, in the cramped bedrooms they share in the attic, the staff exchanges information with the efficiency of a telegraph network. They know Eleanor is expecting. They know roughly when the baby is due. They know which physician has been engaged and which monthly nurse has been hired for the lying-in period. They discuss these matters in low voices over cups of tea and plates of kitchen scraps. And they take a certain quiet pride in their role as keepers of household secrets. There's a curious historical detail worth noting. Servants who revealed their employer's private matters could be dismissed without reference, effectively ending their careers in domestic service. The threat was real and ever-present, and yet the historical record is full of scandals that leaked through the servants' quarters, pregnancies that became gossip, affairs that became public knowledge, secrets that escaped despite every precaution. The wall of silence wasn't impenetrable. It simply required the right pressure, the right grievance, the right combination of opportunity and motive. You find yourself in the servants' hall now, a plain room with a long wooden table where the upper servants take their meals. The housekeeper sits at the head, reviewing accounts with a furrowed brow. The butler reads a newspaper that's 2 days old, passed down from the master's study. In the corner, 2 housemaids whisper to each other, their eyes bright with shared knowledge, their hands busy with mending that doesn't seem to require much attention. Historians still debate the degree to which Victorian servants identified with their employers versus maintaining their own separate culture and loyalties. Some scholars emphasize the genuine affection that could develop between servants and the families they served, particularly in smaller households where relationships were closer. Others point to the fundamental inequality of the arrangement, the way servants were expected to sacrifice their own privacy, their own time, their own bodies to the comfort of their employers. The truth probably varied enormously from household to household, from servant to servant, from day to day. The evening bell rings, and the servants rise to begin their evening duties. You watch them disperse through the hidden passages of the house, each one carrying their piece of the shared secret, each one complicit in Eleanor's invisibility. The footman who will serve dinner knows not to mention the mistress's absence if guests inquire. The parlour-maid who will turn down the beds knows to prepare the lying-in room without being asked. The cook who will prepare the special bland diet for a woman in confinement knows not to record it in the kitchen accounts where curious eyes might see. It takes a village, you think, to hide a pregnancy, not just the woman herself with her corsets and loose gowns and careful performances of normalcy, but an entire household working in concert, maintaining the fiction through 1,000 small acts of discretion and denial. Eleanor may disappear into her lying-in room alone, but she carries the silence of every servant with her, a conspiracy of invisibility that extends from the attic bedrooms to the basement kitchen. The house settles into its evening routines. Somewhere above you, Eleanor takes her tisane and pretends everything is ordinary. Below, the servants continue their quiet work, guardians of secrets they'll never be thanked for keeping. The portrait hangs above the fireplace in the drawing room, and you find yourself staring at it as evening candles are lit around you. Queen Victoria gazes down with that familiar expression, part sternness, part resignation, the face of a woman who ruled an empire but couldn't escape her own biology. She's young in this painting, perhaps 30, her figure still trim, her posture impeccable. But by the time she sat for this portrait, she'd already borne several of the 9 children who would eventually emerge from her small, determined body. 9 pregnancies, 9 deliveries, 9 times the most powerful woman in the world had to retreat from public view because her condition was too indelicate for her subjects to witness. You settle into a chair near the fire and consider the strange paradox of Victoria's legacy. Here was a queen who built her entire public image around domesticity and motherhood. The happy family, the devoted wife, the nurturing mother surrounded by cherubic children in countless official portraits and popular engravings. And yet Victoria herself found pregnancy revolting. She wrote about it with unusual candour in her private letters and journals. The physical discomfort, the loss of dignity, the way it made her feel like a cow or a rabbit, reduced to her animal functions. She endured it because she had to, because producing heirs was her duty, because she loved Albert and he wanted a large family. But she didn't pretend to enjoy it. There's a curious historical detail worth noting. Victoria referred to pregnancy as the shadow side of marriage, and she was remarkably frank about her distaste for the physical realities of childbearing. In letters to her eldest daughter, she warned against the animal nature of frequent pregnancy and expressed something close to envy for women who couldn't have children. This from the woman who symbolised Victorian motherhood, whose image graced nurseries throughout the empire. The gap between public mythology and private feeling could hardly be more stark. The fire crackles and settles, sending a brief cascade of sparks up the chimney. You smell wood smoke and the faint mustiness of old upholstery, the particular scent of a room that's witnessed generations of quiet evenings like this one. Eleanor is elsewhere tonight, resting in her chambers, but the Queen's portrait keeps you company, those painted eyes following you with their complicated knowledge. Despite her personal feelings, Victoria's visible fertility helped normalise large families among the British middle and upper classes. She made motherhood fashionable, even aspirational. Her example gave permission for respectable women to embrace their domestic roles with enthusiasm, to find meaning and purpose in bearing and raising children. The irony is exquisite. A woman who privately despised pregnancy became the public symbol of its glorification. But even Victoria couldn't escape the rules of confinement. When her pregnancies advanced beyond the point of concealment, she withdrew from public duties, just like any other woman. State business was conducted through intermediaries. Public appearances were cancelled. The Queen of England and Empress of India hid herself away until her body was presentable again, because even sovereignty couldn't exempt a woman from the demands of Victorian propriety. Power stopped at the bedroom door. You think about what this must have meant for ordinary women, watching their queens submit to the same regime of invisibility. If Victoria herself had to disappear, what hope did anyone else have of challenging the system? Confinement wasn't just for commoners, it was universal, inescapable, written into the very fabric of respectable womanhood. Historians still debate Victoria's influence on attitudes toward pregnancy and childbirth. Some scholars credit her with elevating the status of motherhood, giving it a dignity and importance it hadn't always enjoyed. Others point out that her public embrace of domesticity helped trap women in narrow roles, glorifying their confinement to home and nursery, while men dominated public life. Victoria herself seemed genuinely ambivalent, proud of her children, resentful of the process that produced them. Devoted to Albert, yet frustrated by the way pregnancy interrupted her work and her relationship with him. The candles flicker in a draught from somewhere and shadows dance across the Queen's painted face. You notice details you hadn't seen before. The slight tension around her mouth, the wariness in her eyes. This isn't a woman at peace with her circumstances. This is a woman performing serenity while her mind churns with all the contradictions of her position. Albert died when Victoria was only 42 and she never fully recovered. But she also never had to be pregnant again, and you wonder sometimes whether some small part of her, a part she would never have acknowledged, felt relieved. 9 children were enough. Her body was her own at last, even if her heart was broken. You rise from the chair and move closer to the portrait, studying the brushwork, the way light falls across the painted silk of her dress. Victoria was barely 5 feet tall, and she struggled with her weight throughout her life. Pregnancy transformed her compact body in ways she found humiliating, and recovery was slow and difficult each time. She had the best medical care available, the most comfortable lying-in arrangements money could buy, and still she found the experience degrading. What must it have been like for women with fewer resources, less support, no army of servants to ease their burden? The clock on the mantel chimes the hour, pulling you back to the present moment, or rather to Eleanor's present moment, this fiction you've constructed together. The portrait remains where it's always been, watching over the drawing room with its complicated gaze. Victoria set the standard for Victorian womanhood, and that standard included silence, concealment, and the transformation of private suffering into public performance. Eleanor will follow the same script, not because she particularly admires Victoria, but because there's no other script available. The Queen made the rules respectable by following them herself, and in doing so she ensured that generations of women would disappear into their lying-in rooms, invisible and unmentioned until they emerged with babies that society was finally willing to acknowledge. The fire burns lower, the candles gutter, and Victoria's portrait watches over it all, keeping her own counsel about the shadow side of the life she made look so appealing. The physician arrives at 11 o'clock precisely, as scheduled, and you watch from the hallway as the butler takes his hat and gloves with the gravity of a state occasion. Dr. Hartley is a man of middle years, with mutton-chop whiskers, and the particular self-assurance that medical training seems to bestow on men of this era. He carries a black leather bag that contains, you imagine, instruments and remedies and the accumulated authority of a profession that's only recently begun to claim dominion over childbirth. Until a generation ago, this would have been women's work entirely. Now the doctors are moving in and everything is changing. You follow Dr. Hartley up the stairs to Eleanor's sitting room, where she waits in a chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap with studied composure. The doctor greets her with professional courtesy, inquiring about her health, her appetite, her sleep. His questions are careful, circling the subject without quite touching it, because even physicians must observe the proprieties. He doesn't examine her, not yet, not today. Physical examinations of pregnant women are conducted rarely, reluctantly, and often through layers of clothing and bedsheets designed to preserve modesty even at the cost of medical accuracy. Here's the curious thing about Victorian obstetrics. It was a battlefield. The doctors and the midwives were at war, and pregnant women were caught in the middle. For centuries, childbirth had been the exclusive province of female midwives, women who learned their craft through apprenticeship and experience, who understood the rhythms of labour from the inside out. But the 19th century saw the rise of the male physician, armed with forceps and chloroform and the confidence of university training. They promised to make childbirth safer, more scientific, more modern, and slowly, inexorably, they pushed the midwives aside. The medicalisation of childbirth was a class phenomenon first and a universal transformation later. Wealthy and middle-class women were the first to engage physicians for their deliveries, partly because they could afford the fees and partly because having a doctor attend your birth became a mark of status and respectability. Working-class women continued to rely on midwives well into the 20th century, not by choice but by economic necessity. The doctor's presence in the birthing room was, like so much else in Victorian life, a signal of social position. Dr. Hartley settles into a chair across from Eleanor and begins discussing the arrangements for her confinement. His tone is authoritative but soothing, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He recommends rest, a bland diet, avoidance of excitement or exertion. He mentions the monthly nurse who will be engaged to attend Eleanor during the final weeks and the lying-in period. a professional woman carefully vetted who will manage the practical details of delivery and recovery. The doctor himself will be summoned when labour begins, arriving to supervise the final act of a drama that will largely unfold without him. You smell the pomade in his hair and the faint chemical tang of whatever he uses to clean his instruments. The fire burns steadily in the grate and the room is warm, perhaps too warm, but Eleanor doesn't complain. She listens to the doctor's instructions with an expression of attentive compliance, nodding at appropriate moments, asking no questions that might suggest she has opinions of her own. This is the expected performance, and she executes it flawlessly. There's a curious historical detail worth noting. The introduction of male physicians into the birthing room created profound anxieties about propriety and sexuality. How could a man, even a medical man, be permitted such intimate access to a woman's body? Various solutions were attempted. Some physicians conducted examinations entirely by touch, without looking, their hands working beneath sheets while their eyes remained decorously averted. Others used specially designed examining tables that concealed the patient's body from view. The whole enterprise was fraught with contradiction, the desire for medical expertise warring with the imperative of female modesty. Historians still debate whether the medicalization of childbirth ultimately helped or harmed women. On one hand, physicians brought new tools and techniques that could save lives in complicated deliveries. The forceps, when used correctly, could pull a baby free from the birth canal. Antiseptic practices, once people actually adopted them, cut down the horrific death toll from childbed fever. But doctors also brought interventions that were completely unnecessary or outright dangerous. Too much bleeding, instruments used inappropriately, this tendency to treat labour like a medical emergency instead of what it was, a natural process. The midwives they pushed out had their own limitations, sure, but they also knew things that got lost in the transition, ways of supporting women in labour that male physicians didn't understand and didn't value. Dr. Hartley stands to leave, and Eleanor stands with him. The consultation's done. He'll come back in 2 weeks to check how she's doing, and again when the time gets closer. His fees are steep, but Eleanor's husband thinks they're worth it for his wife's health and the safe arrival of his heir. The transaction's complete. Expertise traded for money, authority handed from woman to man, the ancient mystery of birth repackaged as a medical procedure. You stay in the sitting room after the doctor leaves, watching Eleanor return to her chair by the window. Her composure holds, but you can sense something underneath it. Not quite fear, not quite resentment, but somewhere in that neighbourhood. She's handed over control of her own body to a man she barely knows, a man who speaks to her with kind condescension and expects his instructions followed without question. This is what progress looks like in the Victorian age, one kind of authority replacing another, the midwife's experienced hands giving way to the doctor's scientific confidence. The afternoon light cuts through the window, catching dust particles in its golden beams. Somewhere in the house the servants keep working, maintaining the elaborate pretense of a household where nothing unusual is going on, and Eleanor sits quietly, one hand resting on the swell of her belly, thinking thoughts she'll never share with Dr. Hartley or anyone else. The medical men have moved in, claimed the territory, and the women who actually bear the children have become patients in their own story, expected to be grateful for the expertise that's been imposed on them. The room smells of ether, sweet and cloying, and you feel your head swim a little as you step closer to the bed, where a woman lies in the peculiar stillness of drugged sleep. This isn't Eleanor's house anymore. You've drifted forward in time, or maybe sideways, into a different story, to witness something that changed everything. The moment when Victorian medicine promised women escape from the ancient agony of childbirth. The promise was seductive. The reality was a lot more complicated. Queen Victoria herself opened the door in 1853. She took chloroform during the delivery of her 8th child, Prince Leopold. and the Queen's endorsement transformed a controversial practice into a fashionable one almost overnight. If the Queen could be knocked out during labour, then surely it was acceptable for other respectable women to seek the same relief. The doctors who'd championed anaesthesia for childbirth found their appointment books suddenly full. The age of painless delivery had arrived, or so it seemed. You watch the physician in this unfamiliar room as he monitors his patient, a cloth soaked in chloroform held near her face, ready to give more if she shows signs of waking. The delivery's progressing slowly, and he's decided that unconsciousness is better than the distressing sounds and movements of active labour. The woman's body continues its work without her conscious participation, contractions rippling across her belly, while her mind floats somewhere far away. It looks peaceful. It's also, in ways no one fully understands yet, profoundly unnatural. Here's a curious detail that historians love to mention. The religious opposition to obstetric anaesthesia was fierce and immediate. Critics cited the book of Genesis, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children," arguing that labour pain was divinely ordained punishment for Eve's sin, and that getting around it was an offence against God. Some clergymen thundered from their pulpits that women who sought relief from childbirth pain were defying their Creator. The response from supporters of anaesthesia was equally biblical. Hadn't God himself administered the first anaesthesia when he caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep before removing his rib? The theological debate raged for years while women continued to suffer, and when they could, to seek relief. The mainstream historical fact is chloroform was genuinely dangerous, though the Victorians didn't fully appreciate the risks. Administered wrong, it could kill, and it did kill with some regularity, both mothers and babies. The dosage was hard to control. The line between effective sedation and fatal overdose distressingly thin. Physicians learned through trial and error, and the errors were buried in churchyards across the country. But the demand for pain relief was so intense that women kept accepting the risks, preferring the possibility of death to the certainty of agony. You step back from the bed, giving the physician room to work, and you think about what it meant to be offered this choice. For all of human history, women had faced childbirth with nothing but their own endurance and whatever comfort other women could provide. The pain was legendary, mythologized, accepted as just part of being female. And then, suddenly there was an alternative. You could slip away from your body at the moment of its greatest trial and return only when the ordeal was over. The temptation must have been overwhelming, but the drugs took something too. The woman on the bed won't remember the birth of her child. She won't experience that moment of emergence, the first cry, the weight of a new life placed on her chest. She's traded pain for absence, and absence has its own costs. Some women mourned this loss, others considered it a fair exchange. The choice itself was revolutionary, the idea that women had any say at all in how their bodies were treated during delivery. Historians still argue about the long-term effects of Victorian obstetric anaesthesia on women's experience of childbirth. Some scholars see it as a crucial step toward bodily autonomy, the recognition that women had a right to relief from suffering. Others point out that anaesthesia was administered by male physicians, often without the patient's explicit consent, as part of a broader medicalization that removed women's control over their own bodies. The twilight sleep movement of the early 20th century would take this logic to its extreme, rendering women completely unconscious for deliveries that could last days, leaving them with no memory of having given birth at all. The chloroform does its work, and the woman on the bed stays still, her breathing shallow but steady. The physician checks her pulse, makes a note in his ledger, and prepares for the final stage of delivery. He's confident in his methods, proud of the relief he's providing. He doesn't think of himself as taking anything from his patient. He thinks of himself as giving her a gift. You drift toward the window where grey light filters through lace curtains. The world outside continues its ordinary business. A cart rattles past. A dog barks. A child calls out to a playmate. None of them know what's happening in this room, this small revolution in the management of pain. The woman will wake, eventually, groggy and disoriented, and someone will tell her that she has a daughter or a son. She'll feel the soreness in her body, the evidence of what has passed, but the experience itself will be a blank space in her memory. Is this better? You find yourself unable to answer the question with any certainty. The Victorians couldn't answer it either, which is why the debate continued for decades, evolving as new drugs and new techniques emerged. What they did know, what every woman who faced childbirth knew, was that the pain was real, and the desire to escape it wasn't weakness or cowardice, but simple human longing for relief. The physician murmurs something to the nurse, who monthly nurse, Eleanor's doctor mentioned, maybe, or someone very like her. The delivery's almost complete now. Soon there'll be a baby crying and alive, and a mother who slept through her own transformation. The promise of Victorian medicine kept and broken in the same breath. You turn away from the window and let the scene fade, carrying with you the sweet smell of chloroform and the complicated weight of progress. The workhouse rises before you like a rebuke, its brick walls stained with soot and rain, its windows small and mean as suspicious eyes. You've left the comfortable world of Eleanor's townhouse far behind. Here, in this grim institution on the outskirts of the city, a different kind of pregnant woman waits, one for whom there'll be no lying in room with velvet curtains, no physician with a leather bag, no conspiracy of servants to guard her secret. For the unmarried mother, Victorian England reserved a special kind of cruelty, and you're about to witness it. Her name doesn't matter, because the system was designed to erase her. She might be Mary, or Sarah, or Jane. They were almost always given plain names in the records, as if even their identities were too good for them. She's maybe 19, maybe younger, and she's utterly alone. The father of her child has disappeared or denied responsibility, or never existed as far as respectable society is concerned. Her own family has thrown her out. The household where she worked as a domestic servant fired her the moment her condition became apparent. She has nowhere else to go, and so she's come here, to the workhouse, where the destitute are warehoused and the fallen are punished. You follow her through the entrance, where a matron in a severe grey dress records her name and her shame in a large ledger. The questions are pointed, designed to humiliate. Who's the father? Why did she allow this to happen? Does she understand the disgrace she's brought upon herself? The girl answers, in a voice barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed on the floor. She's already learned that defiance only makes things worse. Here's the curious detail that historians love to mention. Workhouses were explicitly designed to be unpleasant. This wasn't a failure of compassion, but a deliberate policy choice. The theory, embraced by Victorian reformers and lawmakers alike, was that poor relief should be so miserable that only the truly desperate would seek it. If the workhouse was comfortable, the reasoning went, people would have no incentive to support themselves. So the food was deliberately inadequate, the work deliberately hard, the conditions deliberately degrading. And for unmarried mothers, the regime was harsher still because their poverty was considered a moral failing rather than mere misfortune. The mainstream historical fact is unmarried mothers in workhouses were often separated into a distinct category, subjected to additional restrictions and humiliations. They might be required to wear different clothing, identifying their status to everyone they encountered. They were given the most unpleasant tasks, scrubbing floors, washing laundry, picking oakum until their fingers bled, and they were lectured constantly about their sin, their shame, their need for repentance. The goal wasn't rehabilitation, but punishment, a public demonstration that sexual transgression wouldn't be tolerated. You watched the girl being led away to be processed, stripped, bathed, dressed in the rough uniform of the workhouse, her own clothes taken and stored against the day she might leave. The dormitory where she'll sleep holds dozens of iron beds packed close together, privacy non-existent. The smell is overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, carbolic soap, boiled cabbage, and something else beneath it all, something that speaks of despair and resignation. She'll give birth here, attended by other inmates or maybe a workhouse midwife if she's lucky, and then she'll face an impossible choice. The child. What happens to the child? This is where the Victorian system reveals its full brutality. An unmarried mother could keep her baby, but only by staying in the workhouse, working to pay for her own support and the child's. Or she could leave the child behind, surrendering it to the institution, hoping it might be adopted or apprenticed or just survive long enough to make its own way in the world. Many children didn't survive. The mortality rates in workhouse nurseries were staggering. A quiet massacre that troubled consciences, but never quite enough to change the system. Historians still argue about how Victorian society justified this treatment of unmarried mothers and their children. Some scholars emphasize the genuine fear of social breakdown, the belief that tolerating illegitimacy would lead to chaos and immorality. Others point to economic anxieties, the worry that supporting fallen women would encourage dependency and drain public resources. Still others see simple misogyny at work, a system designed by men to punish women for sexual behavior that men themselves engaged in without consequence. The truth probably includes all of these elements tangled together in ways that resist easy separation. You find a corner where you can observe without being noticed, and you watch the daily rhythm of the workhouse unfold. Women shuffle past in their identical dresses, faces blank or bitter, or occasionally terribly, still hopeful. Some carry infants clutched close as if the babies might be taken at any moment, which of course they might. The matrons move among them, keys jangling, voices sharp with authority. This is a factory of sorts, you realise, a machine for processing human misery into something manageable and out of sight. The girl you followed has disappeared into this machine, absorbed into its routines, her individual story submerged in the collective tragedy of all the women like her. She'll give birth in a few weeks, and then she'll face the choice that breaks hearts. Keep the child and stay trapped, or leave and lose everything. There's no good option, only degrees of devastation. You think of Eleanor in her comfortable confinement, surrounded by servants and physicians and soft linens. The contrast is almost too painful to hold in your mind. Both women are pregnant. Both are hidden away from respectable society. But one is hidden in luxury, her invisibility a temporary inconvenience before she resumes her place in the world. The other is hidden in shame, her invisibility a punishment that may never end. The workhouse bell rings, summoning inmates to their evening meal. You don't follow them to the dining hall, where thin gruel awaits. Instead, you slip back toward the entrance, toward the grey light of the outside world, carrying with you the weight of what you've seen. Not all Victorian pregnancies were hidden the same way. Some were hidden in silk and whalebone. Others were hidden in workhouse walls and ledgers that recorded shame like a crime. The building looks almost respectable from the outside. A modest brick house on a quiet street, a small brass plaque by the door, curtains drawn against curious eyes. You've followed whispers and rumours to this place, a baby farm on the outskirts of the city where unwanted children are received and cared for in exchange for a weekly fee. At least that's what the advertisement promised. The reality, as you're about to discover, is considerably darker. A woman answers your knock, her face arranged in an expression of professional sympathy. She's Mrs. Waters or Mrs. Williams or Mrs. something or other. The names change, the story stays the same. She runs a service for desperate mothers. She explains women who can't keep their children but can't bear to leave them in the workhouse. For a reasonable sum, she'll take the baby, nurse it, care for it, find it a good home when the time is right. Her voice is soothing, her manner reassuring. She's done this many times before. You step inside and immediately notice the smell. Sour milk and something worse, something you don't want to identify. The hallway is dim, the wallpaper peeling, the floorboards creaking beneath your feet. From somewhere upstairs comes a thin, reedy crying, the sound of an infant who's learned that crying brings no comfort. Mrs. Waters doesn't seem to hear it. She's too busy explaining her terms, her fees, her absolute discretion. No questions asked, no records kept. The mother's secret is safe with her. Here's the curious detail that historians love to mention. Baby farming was a thriving industry in Victorian England, existing in a legal grey zone that authorities were reluctant to examine too closely. The women who ran these establishments filled a genuine need. There were thousands of illegitimate babies born each year, and their mothers had few options. Some baby farmers were honest, doing their best with limited resources to care for children no one else wanted. But others were something far worse, and everyone knew it, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. The mainstream historical fact is the mortality rate at baby farms was catastrophic. Some estimates suggest that as many as 90% of infants placed in certain establishments died within weeks or months. The causes were various: starvation, neglect, disease, overdoses of laudanum administered to keep hungry babies quiet, and in some cases the deaths weren't passive but active, deliberate killings disguised as natural causes. The babies were worth more dead than alive. You see, a dead baby required no feeding, no care, no ongoing expense. The fee had already been collected. The mother would never come back to check, and one less unwanted child in the world troubled few consciences. You follow Mrs. Waters up the narrow stairs, and the crying grows louder. She opens a door onto a small room crowded with cradles, and you see them. A dozen infants, maybe more, lying in varying states of distress. Some are silent, too weak to cry, their eyes dull and unseeing. Others wail with the desperate energy of creatures who know they're fighting for their lives. The smell is overwhelming now. Unchanged diapers, sour milk, the particular sweetness of sickness. A single woman moves among the cradles, offering a spoonful of something to one baby, adjusting the blanket of another. She can't possibly care for all of them. She's not meant to. Mrs. Waters watches your face, gauging your reaction. She has a story ready, an explanation for everything. The children are teething. They had a touch of fever. The wet nurse was sick last week. The excuses flow smoothly, polished by repetition. And you understand that she's given this tour many times before. Mothers come here desperate and leave relieved, believing their children will be safe. They don't return. They can't afford to return, financially or emotionally, and so they never see what you're seeing now. Historians still argue about how much Victorian society truly knew about the horrors of baby farming versus how much it chose not to know. Several high-profile scandals broke through the wall of silence. The case of Margaret Waters in 1870, who was hanged for the murder of infants in her care, or Amelia Dyer in the 1890s, who may have killed hundreds of babies over decades. These cases prompted outrage, reform efforts, new legislation requiring registration and inspection of baby farms, but the reforms were always inadequate. The inspections easily evaded, the system too useful to too many people to be truly dismantled. You back out of the room, unable to bear it any longer. The crying follows you down the stairs, through the dim hallway, out into the street where the air is cleaner, but not clean enough. Mrs. Waters calls after you, still offering her services, still promising discretion and care. The door closes and you stand on the pavement, trying to breathe, trying to understand how a society that sentimentalized childhood could permit such horrors to flourish in its shadows. But you do understand, don't you? The babies in that house are the other side of Victorian propriety, the hidden cost of all that silence and shame. Every unmarried mother who was cast out, every pregnancy that had to be concealed, every child who couldn't be acknowledged, They all flowed toward places like this, toward women like Mrs. Waters, toward cradles where survival was the exception rather than the rule. The system that hid pregnancy also hid its consequences, sweeping the evidence of sexual transgression into institutions where it could quietly disappear. You think of Eleanor in her comfortable lying-in room, her legitimate baby who'll be welcomed into the world with joy and celebration. And you think of the girl in the workhouse, facing her impossible choice, maybe even now, considering whether a baby farm might be the answer to her prayers. The distance between them is measured in class and circumstance, in marriage lines and family support, in all the arbitrary factors that determine whether a pregnancy is a blessing or a catastrophe. The street is quiet. A lamplighter moves in the distance, bringing light to the gathering dusk. And somewhere behind you, in that modest brick house with its drawn curtains, the thin crying continues. A sound that'll echo through Victorian history, mostly unheard, deliberately forgotten, but never quite silenced. The black crape hangs heavy in the windows, and you know before you even enter the house that death has visited. This isn't Eleanor's home. We've drifted again, carried by the current of Victorian experience to another household, another story, another woman who won't see her child grow up. The mourning wreath on the door tells everyone what's happened. A wife, a mother lost in childbed. It was so common that the Victorians had rituals for it, protocols and procedures, black-edged stationery waiting in desk drawers for the letters that would need to be written. You step inside and the silence is profound. The mirrors have been covered with cloth. The clocks have been stopped. Somewhere upstairs, a baby cries, the baby who survived when its mother didn't. The servants move through the house like ghosts themselves, speaking in whispers, their faces drawn with genuine grief or the performance of it. The master of the house is in his study, they tell you, and has asked not to be disturbed. He's just become a widower and a father in the same terrible hour. The smell of death lingers, despite the best efforts of the household. They've burned herbs and opened windows, but the sweetness persists, that unmistakable scent that the Victorians knew so intimately. It mingles with the camphor of mourning clothes pulled from storage, the beeswax of candles burning in the sick room, the particular staleness of a house where normal life has stopped. You breathe shallowly and move toward the stairs. Here's the fact that shadows everything we've discussed so far. Childbirth killed. It killed relentlessly, indiscriminately, taking young women in the prime of their lives and leaving behind motherless children and shattered families. The maternal mortality rate in Victorian England was staggering by modern standards, somewhere between 4 and 8 deaths per 1,000 live births, depending on the decade and the source. That might not sound like much until you remember that women often gave birth 5, 6, 7 times or more. The cumulative risk was terrifying. Every pregnancy was a gamble with death. The mainstream historical fact is this. Childbed fever, also called puerperal fever, was the single greatest killer of new mothers. It was an infection usually introduced during delivery by the unwashed hands of physicians and midwives, and it spread through maternity wards like wildfire. Women would give birth successfully, seem to recover, and then develop fever, chills, and the terrible pain that signalled the infection taking hold. Within days, sometimes hours, they were dead. The Hungarian physician Ignác Semmelweis discovered in the 1840s that hand-washing could dramatically reduce these deaths, but his findings were ignored and ridiculed for decades. Doctors were gentlemen, the reasoning went, and gentlemen's hands couldn't possibly carry disease. You reach the door of the lying-in room, a room much like the one prepared for Eleanor, with its heavy curtains and sealed windows and air of enforced seclusion. But this room has become a death chamber. The bed has been stripped, the linens burned, the mattress taken away to be destroyed. They'll scrub the floor with carbolic acid, repaint the walls, try to erase every trace of what happened here. But the memory will remain, soaked into the very bones of the house. Historians still argue about why it took so long for antiseptic practices to be adopted in obstetrics. Some scholars blame professional arrogance, the unwillingness of physicians to accept that they themselves were the agents of death. Others point to the slow pace of scientific communication, the difficulty of proving causation in an era before germ theory was fully understood. Still others see economic factors at work. Hand-washing took time, and time was money, and physicians had many patients to attend. Whatever the combination of causes, the result was generations of women dying from infections that could have been prevented. You stand in the empty room and think about Eleanor, still weeks away from her own delivery. She doesn't know whether she'll survive. No one knows. The physician she trusts may bring death on his hands without meaning to. The lying-in room that was prepared so carefully may become her tomb. This is the shadow that hangs over every Victorian pregnancy, the fear that no amount of wealth or preparation can entirely dispel. Women wrote farewell letters before their confinements. They made arrangements for their children. They faced childbirth with the courage of soldiers going into battle, knowing that not all of them would return. The baby's crying has stopped. Maybe the wet nurse has arrived to feed it. This motherless child who will grow up with only a portrait to remember the woman who gave it life. The house will eventually emerge from mourning, 6 months, a year, depending on the family's sense of propriety. The widower may remarry, often does remarry, because a household needs a mistress and children need a mother, even if she isn't the one who bore them. Life goes on, as the Victorians knew better than anyone. It has no choice. You descend the stairs slowly, letting your hand trail along the banister. The black crepe ripples slightly as you pass, stirred by your movement, or maybe by something less explicable. Death was so present in Victorian life that it became almost domestic, an expected guest who might arrive at any time. The elaborate mourning rituals, the memorial jewellery woven from dead women's hair, the photographs of corpses arranged to look merely sleeping. All of these were ways of accommodating death, of making room for it in the daily business of living. The front door closes behind you and you step back into a world that continues despite the tragedy within. A carriage passes. A street vendor calls out his wares. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seem almost obscene in their beauty. Inside the house, the morning has just begun. But outside, London carries on, indifferent and eternal, full of women who are pregnant right now, who are facing the same odds, who are writing their own farewell letters just in case. Eleanor doesn't know yet whether she'll be among the survivors. She has faith in her physician, in her lying-in arrangements, in the prayers she whispers each night before sleep. But faith isn't certainty, and the black crepe waits in every linen closet, ready to be hung when hope runs out. The nursery is 2 floors up, tucked beneath the eaves, where the sounds of crying won't disturb the family below. You climb the narrow servants' staircase to reach it, passing a housemaid carrying fresh linens and a footman with a scuttle of coal. The hierarchy of a Victorian house is written in its architecture. The family occupies the principal floors, comfortable and visible, while children and servants are stored above and below. Necessary, but not quite present. You push open the nursery door and enter a world that exists parallel to the one downstairs, connected but separate, governed by its own rules. The wet nurse sits by the window, a baby at her breast. She isn't the child's mother. She has her own child somewhere, farmed out to someone else so that she can sell her milk to a family that can afford to buy it. This is the Victorian economy of motherhood, and it runs on the bodies of working-class women who have something the wealthy need. Her name is Hannah, or maybe Martha, and she'll live in this nursery for months, feeding another woman's baby, while her own grows up without her. You watch her face as the infant suckles. There's tenderness there, despite everything. The human capacity to love isn't easily suppressed. But there's also resignation, a kind of professional distance that allows her to do this work without being destroyed by it. She's done this before, she'll do it again. Her milk is a commodity, and she's learned to think of it that way, even as her body responds to the baby's need with all the hormonal urgency of genuine motherhood. Here's the curious detail that historians love to mention. The selection of a wet nurse was a serious business, governed by detailed criteria and considerable anxiety. Families scrutinised candidates for physical health, moral character, the quality and quantity of their milk, even the temperament they might transmit to the child through nursing. Medical authorities offered contradictory advice. Some insisted that a wet nurse should be brunette rather than blonde, or that she should avoid strong emotions that might sour her milk. The whole enterprise was saturated with folk belief and pseudoscience, reflecting the profound importance Victorians placed on infant feeding and the profound ignorance that surrounded it. The mainstream historical fact is this: wet nursing was primarily a practice of the wealthy and middle classes who could afford to hire another woman to perform the labour of breastfeeding. Working-class mothers nursed their own children when they could, though this was often impossible for women who had to return to factory work or domestic service shortly after giving birth. These women relied on artificial feeding, bottles of cow's milk or patent foods that were often nutritionally inadequate and contaminated with bacteria. The result was appalling infant mortality among the poor, rates that dwarfed anything seen in the comfortable nurseries of the upper classes. You move deeper into the nursery, past the wet nurse and her charge, into the adjoining room where older children are being supervised by a nursery maid. They're playing quietly, as Victorian children were expected to do, their voices low, their movements contained. The room is warm. A fire burns in the grate, carefully guarded by a brass fender, and the walls are papered with cheerful illustrations of nursery rhymes. But there's also something faintly oppressive about the space, a sense of confinement that mirrors in its own way the lying-in room below. The children won't see their mother often. This is the custom of the class to which they belong. They'll be raised by nurses and governesses, presented to their parents for an hour in the evening, dispatched to their rooms when adult company arrives. Motherhood, for women like Eleanor, is a supervisory role rather than a hands-on occupation. She'll make decisions about her children's education, their clothing, their moral instruction, but the daily work of caring for them, the feeding, the bathing, the soothing of nightmares, will be performed by hired women who may love the children genuinely but can never claim them. Historians still argue about the emotional consequences of this arrangement for both mothers and children. Some scholars emphasise the genuine bonds that could form between nurses and their charges, relationships that lasted lifetimes and were remembered with deep affection. Others point to the distance and formality that characterised many Victorian parent-child relationships, the sense of alienation that could result from being raised by servants. The truth, as always, varied by family, by circumstance, by the personalities involved. But what's undeniable is that Victorian motherhood looked very different depending on which side of the class divide you stood. You think of the wet nurse, Hannah or Martha, and wonder about the child she left behind. Who's feeding that baby now? A grandmother, maybe, or a neighbour, paid a few shillings a week, or some arrangement even more precarious. The wet nurse earns good wages for her work, better than she could earn in a factory or as a domestic servant, and she sends most of it home to support her own family. But the cost is measured in something other than money, in the weight of a child she can't hold, in the milk that flows for another woman's baby while her own makes do with whatever substitutes are available. The fire crackles and settles. The children in the next room laugh at something, a brief bright sound, quickly hushed by the nursery maid. The wet nurse shifts the baby to her other breast, her movements practised and efficient. This is the hidden machinery of Victorian motherhood, the labour that makes the pretty picture possible. The nurses and maids and governesses who do the work while the ladies of the house maintain their distance and their dignity. Eleanor will emerge from her confinement and resume her place in society. She'll visit the nursery once or twice a day, inquire about her child's progress, issue instructions about diet and discipline, but she won't nurse the baby herself. That would be common, déclassé, a sign that she couldn't afford proper help. Her body will heal faster without the strain of nursing, her figure will return to what it was before pregnancy, and the wet nurse will continue her silent duty beneath the eaves, offering what only a mother can offer to a child who isn't hers. The afternoon light is disappearing, shifting from gold to grey. You step out of the nursery and make your way down the stairs, coming back to the world where mothers are ladies and ladies don't nurse. The elderly woman's hands are twisted with age, her fingers bent but still quick as she prepares a compress from herbs scattered across her kitchen table. You've travelled a long way from the refined townhouses and harsh workhouses to reach her, a cottage at the edge of a village where the old customs survive, where science feels like a distant whisper and wisdom is counted in generations. She's a wise woman, though she wouldn't use that term. The villagers seek her out for treatments and counsel, for assistance with things that doctors don't grasp and ministers don't endorse, and they come particularly when babies are expected. The scent of the cottage is rich and layered, bundles of drying herbs suspended from the beams, wood smoke, the subtle sweetness of beeswax, the deeper note of preserved roots and animal fat. You sit down on a stool near the fire and listen as she speaks, her voice quiet and steady, carrying understanding that reaches back centuries. She learned from her mother, who learned from her grandmother, and back through time to an age when women controlled their own bodies, without interference from men in dark coats. "Here's what the doctors won't mention," she says, crumbling dried raspberry leaves between her palms. "Pregnancy isn't an illness. Birth isn't a disease. Women's bodies understand what to do, and most of the time, if you step back and provide what they need, things work out just fine. Her treatments are straightforward, wholesome foods, easy movement, teas to calm nausea and fortify the womb, compresses to ease sore backs. She doesn't have forceps, no chloroform, no tools of intervention. What she has is observation gathered over endless births witnessed, endless mothers guided through the drawn-out hours of labour. The accepted historical reality is folk medicine and traditional midwifery existed alongside and frequently clashed with official medical practice. Throughout the Victorian period, rural communities especially preserved their own healing customs, handed down through networks of women who couldn't afford doctors and didn't fully trust them regardless. These customs included real wisdom, the healing qualities of particular herbs, methods for handling labour, the significance of emotional comfort during delivery, but also superstitions that could be dangerous or just worthless. The boundary between the two wasn't always obvious, even to the practitioners themselves. You ask about the superstitions, and the old woman laughs, a dry sound like leaves rustling. "Oh, there are many," she acknowledges. "Some mothers refuse to reach overhead for fear the cord will twist around the baby's neck. Some bury the afterbirth beneath a rosebush to guarantee the child's beauty. Some keep a knife under the bed to slice through the pain." She doesn't trust most of it. Or more accurately, she trusts that faith itself holds power, that a woman who feels safe may labour more smoothly than one who's frightened. The rituals fulfill a function, even if that function isn't the one they claim. Here's an interesting detail that historians enjoy pointing out. Victorian traditions around pregnancy were remarkably varied, changing from region to region, village to village, sometimes even household to household. Some customs had deep roots in Celtic or Anglo-Saxon practice, others were adapted from neighbouring cultures or created entirely in response to local situations. A woman in Cornwall might observe completely different customs than a woman in Yorkshire, each certain that her way was the proper way, the tested way, the way her people had always approached things. The fire crackles, throwing a spray of sparks up the chimney. The old woman keeps working, adding ingredients to a small pot that bubbles on the hearth. This is a tonic, she explains, for a young wife in the village who's been having trouble conceiving. The recipe contains honey, nettle, and several herbs you can't identify. Whether it will work is impossible to determine, but the young wife trusts it will, and the old woman has witnessed stranger things produce results. Historians continue to debate the effectiveness of traditional remedies compared to the developing scientific medicine of the Victorian age. Some researchers have discovered genuine pharmacological foundation for certain folk treatments. Raspberry leaf, for example, does seem to contain compounds that may benefit uterine function. Others argue that many traditional practices were rooted in magical thinking instead of empirical observation, and that some were actively harmful. The reality probably contains both, a messy blend of wisdom and foolishness. Beneficial interventions and damaging ones all wrapped together in traditions that had no way of separating what succeeded from what just appeared to work. Think about Eleanor, distant in her London townhouse, meeting with doctors who wear formal coats and speak Latin. She would never consider seeking guidance from a woman like this, a cottage healer with dirt beneath her fingernails and superstition in her remedies. The class separation is complete, the epistemological separation nearly as total. And yet both women are attempting to answer the same questions. How do you deliver a baby safely into the world? How do you shield a mother's body through its most perilous transformation? How do you handle pain and fear and the 1,000 things that can go wrong? The old woman glances up from her work and meets your eyes with a look that seems to perceive more than it should. You're questioning which way is superior, she says. That's not the right question. The right question is whether anyone is paying attention to the mothers, whether anyone is asking what they need, what they desire, what frightens them. The methods aren't as important as the attention. She goes back to her compress, her crooked fingers pressing the paste into a cloth, and you grasp that this is her real medicine. Not the herbs, but the listening. Not the rituals, but the presence. The light outside the cottage window is fading, the afternoon moving toward evening. You stand to leave, thanking her for her time, and she dismisses your gratitude with a careless gesture. Women have always supported women, she says. It's how we endure. The door shuts behind you, and you pause for a moment in the dimming light, considering all the understanding that exists in places like this. Unrecorded, unofficial, easily dismissed, but stubbornly persistent, transferred from hand to hand like an inheritance that refuses to disappear. The pamphlet is slim, cheaply made, and completely radical. You hold it in your hands in a cramped office above a printer's shop, where the smell of ink and paper is overpowering and the sound of the press below creates a constant rhythmic pounding. The woman who handed it to you stands by the window, observing the street below with the caution of someone used to scrutiny. Her name doesn't matter, she prefers it that way, but her work is starting to crack the wall of silence that has enclosed pregnancy and women's health for generations. You read the title, something like Plain Words for Wives and Mothers, or A Woman's Guide to Her Own Body. The language is straightforward, almost surprisingly so after all the euphemisms you've encountered. It describes pregnancy in medical terms, it explains the phases of labour, it provides advice on nutrition, rest, and the warning signs that should make a woman seek help. There are no delicate references to sensitive conditions or interesting states. There is only information presented clearly. For any woman who can read, this is the slow breaking of silence. You understand that somewhere in the Victorian age, a handful of courageous people began to speak what couldn't be spoken, to write what shouldn't be written, to pull the secret of pregnancy into the light where it could be examined and understood. They were reformers and radicals, doctors who broke with their profession's code of propriety, feminists who believed that women had a right to knowledge about their own bodies, and they were dangerous, at least in the view of those who preferred the old ways of ignorance and control. Here's the interesting detail that historians enjoy mentioning. Some of these reformers faced legal prosecution for their efforts. The Comstock laws in America and the Obscene Publications Act in Britain made it illegal to distribute material considered obscene. and information about reproduction often landed in this category. Pamphlets on contraception were confiscated, books on childbirth were prohibited. The message was unmistakable. Women's bodies were not an appropriate subject for public discussion, and anyone who thought differently would face the consequences. The silence wasn't just cultural, but legal, enforced by courts and police, as well as gossip and shame. The accepted historical reality is the movement for women's health education gained strength throughout the latter half of the 19th century despite intense opposition. Pioneers like Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to earn a medical degree in America, wrote extensively on women's health and challenged the male medical establishment's monopoly on knowledge. In Britain, reformers established clinics and published guides aimed at working-class women who had no access to doctors and no other source of dependable information. These efforts were scattered, often underfunded and constantly under threat, but they represented something genuinely new, the concept that women had a right to comprehend what was happening inside their own bodies. You look up from the pamphlet and meet the eyes of the woman by the window. She has risked a great deal to produce these materials. Her reputation, her freedom, possibly her safety. There are influential people who would rather that women remain ignorant, who profit from the shame and silence surrounding pregnancy. But she believes that knowledge is power, that a woman who comprehends her body is better positioned to protect it, and that the darkness surrounding childbirth has taken too many lives. The printing press pounds on below, producing sheet after sheet of words that will make their way into hands like yours, into homes where women whisper secrets they were never meant to know. It's not sufficient yet. The change is gradual, generational, fought inch by inch against entrenched resistance. But something is moving, some crack appearing in the structure of propriety that has kept pregnancy concealed for so long. Historians continue to debate what drove this movement, whether it was primarily feminist politics or public health concerns, or the gradual secularization of society that made it possible to discuss bodies without reference to sin and shame. Some scholars emphasize the role of individual pioneers whose courage and persistence made change possible. Others point to broader social forces, industrialization, urbanization, the rise of literacy that created conditions where old patterns of silence could no longer persist. The truth, as always, is probably some combination of all these factors, impossible to separate into clean causes and effects. You think about Eleanor, still in her confinement, still surrounded by whispers and euphemisms, still navigating a system designed to keep her ignorant. Will pamphlets like this reach her? Probably not. They circulate in different circles among women who have less to lose by speaking plainly. But her daughters might encounter them, or her granddaughters. The change will arrive, even if Eleanor herself never witnesses it. The woman by the window turns back to you and extends her hand for the pamphlet. She needs to package them for distribution, get them out of the shop before any official comes asking questions. You hand it over reluctantly, wishing you could keep it, this small artifact of resistance. But it has work to do. Knowledge to share, silences to shatter. It can't sit on a shelf being admired. The stairs creak as you descend back to street level, leaving behind the smell of ink and the pounding of the press. Outside, London continues in its usual chaos. Carriages and pedestrians, vendors and vagrants, the vast machinery of empire grinding forward. Somewhere in this city, women are pregnant right now, concealing their condition, preparing for confinements, facing childbirth with whatever information they've managed to collect. Most of them know almost nothing, but that is beginning to change. You walk through streets that are starting to dim toward evening, thinking about cracks in walls and light getting through. The Victorian era won't last forever. The silence is fracturing, and somewhere, in a cramped room above a print shop, the future is being composed, one broadsheet at a time. The century is shifting. You sense it everywhere, a feeling of closure and genesis that permeates everything like dawn fog. The gas lamps are surrendering to electric light in certain homes now, and the horse-drawn buggies divide the avenues with the first coughing motorcars. Queen Victoria is elderly, her dominion reaching back so distantly that most cannot recall an era preceding it. And somewhere in London, Eleanor, or a woman remarkably similar to her a generation hence, is readying herself for a delivery that will appear both recognisable and curiously altered from what we have observed together. The birthing chamber remains, but the drapes are not pulled quite so firmly. A doctor will still be present, but he has discovered the importance of washing his hands, and the dread of puerperal fever has started to diminish. The stays are relaxing both literally and metaphorically. Dress is evolving toward designs that permit a bit more space for the form within, and while pregnancy remains unmentioned openly in refined sitting rooms, the quiet has fissures in it now, delicate ruptures that will expand with each successive decade until the entire structure finally collapses. You stand beside a window overlooking a yard where the final roses of fall are wilting. The illumination is gentle, amber, the sort of illumination that renders everything dreamlike, even while it unfolds. Within the dwelling, a woman reposes in her bedroom, her confinement nearly concluded. Her infant expected any moment now. She has studied pamphlets that her mother never encountered. She has posed questions that her grandmother would never have possessed the courage to articulate. She remains frightened. Childbirth continues to be perilous and will continue to be perilous for decades still. But her apprehension is tempered with understanding, and understanding is a form of strength. Here's the intriguing detail that scholars adore recounting. The absolute conclusion of the Victorian period witnessed the emergence of what would evolve into the contemporary, natural childbirth philosophy, an ideology that dismissed both the extreme medicalisation of delivery and the myths of traditional practice in preference for educated, aware involvement by the mother. Visionaries like Grantley Dick Red, whose contributions would flourish in the 20th century, were already starting to challenge whether the suffering and anxiety of childbirth were unavoidable or whether they were partially manufactured by the tradition of concealment and unknowing that enveloped the experience. The conclusions they reached would revolutionize obstetrics, though the revolution would require generations to finish. The documented historical reality is maternal death rates started to decrease substantially in the early 20th century, propelled by advances in antiseptic technique, superior nourishment, and ultimately the arrival of antibiotics and blood replacement. The atrocities we observed, the puerperal fever, the infant farms, the anguished decisions of unwed mothers, did not vanish immediately. But they lessened gradually, inconsistently, as medical science progressed and cultural perspectives transformed. The efforts of the activists, the doctors, the suffragists, and the innumerable anonymous women who simply declined to tolerate the traditional methods ultimately produced results. You pivot from the window and proceed through the dwelling, bidding farewell to spaces we have explored together. The parlour where Eleanor posed for her likeness, concealing her state beneath dark satin. The dressing room where the seamstress performed her artistry of disguise. The service stairway where murmured wisdom travelled upward and downward, the birthing chamber with its thick drapes and closed windows suspended like a caught breath. These locations will endure into the new century, but their significance will transform, their ceremonies will moderate, their hush will progressively fill with conversation. Scholars still dispute about when precisely the Victorian mindset toward pregnancy ultimately perished, whether it was the chaos of the Great War, the cultural upheavals of the 1920s, the women's movements of the later 20th century, or some steady accumulation of minor modifications that finally achieved a critical mass. The reality is likely that it never wholly perished, that remnants of disgrace and hush linger even today, that the labour of bringing pregnancy into visibility is continuing and perhaps never finished. But what is certain is that the world we are departing is distinct from the world that came after, that women's reality of pregnancy transformed dramatically in the decades following Victoria's passing, and that much of what we have observed together would become, eventually, nearly incomprehensible. The yard is tranquil. A bird calls somewhere, a late autumn melody, mournful and lovely. The roses are wilting, but they will blossom again next season, and the season following that, and the season following that. This is how transformation occurs, not in spectacular upheavals, but in slow rotations, season after season, generation after generation, each one bearing forward what was discovered and abandoning what no longer benefits you. Consider all the women we have met on this passage. Eleanor in her stays, enacting normality while her form evolved. The young woman in the poorhouse confronting her unbearable decision. The infants in the crowded rooms of the infant farm, wailing for solace that would never arrive. The mother who perished in delivery, abandoning a spouse and a motherless infant. The wet nurse under the rafters, offering her milk to another woman's child. The cunning woman in her dwelling, grinding herbs and attending. The activist in her crowded room, producing pamphlets that would alter the world. They are all present somehow in this waning afternoon illumination. They are all fragments of the narrative we have shared together. The narrative of how pregnancy was obscured and why and what it demanded, and how the obscuring slowly, imperfectly started to cease. Their existences were confined by restrictions we can scarcely fathom, but they were also filled with bravery and fortitude and the obstinate determination on endurance that has perpetually characterized women confronting the unthinkable. The illumination continues to wane. The yard descends into darkness, and somewhere in the dwelling, a woman anticipates her infant's arrival, bearing within her all the terror and aspiration of every woman who has ever attempted this, extending backward to the origin of time and forward into a future she cannot perceive but might, if she is fortunate, help to mould. The hearth has diminished now, and the space is shadowy. You have journeyed far tonight, through gaslit chambers and bleak poorhouses, through nurseries and dwellings and crowded rooms where revolution was produced on inexpensive paper. You have witnessed disgrace and hush, bravery and brutality, the intricate apparatus of disguise and the slow, agonizing labor of carrying truth to visibility. But now it is time to repose. Let the visions fade gently, like coals cooling in a hearth. Let the sounds quiet, one after another, until only stillness endures. The women we have encountered tonight are at tranquility now, their battles concluded, their narratives shared. They have crossed through the curtain that divides then from now, leaving behind only reverberations and teachings, and the subtle, enduring aspiration that circumstances can transform, that hush can be shattered, that the obscured can be carried into the visibility. Your respiration slows. Your form settles further into whatever comfort supports you. The burden of the day rises from your shoulders, and you sense yourself floating gently towards slumber. There is nothing you must accomplish now. There is nowhere you must exist. The extended passage is finished, and repose has been merited. Consider warmth. Consider safety. Consider the innumerable women who endured, who carried life into existence despite everything, who transmitted their fortitude down through generations until it contacted you. Here now, in this tranquil instant, you are the recipient of their bravery, you are the heir of their anguish, and you are protected, enveloped in comforts they could barely conceive, supported by a world that has discovered slowly and imperfectly to appreciate what they withstood. The hearth is nearly extinguished now, just a few coals radiating in the obscurity, gentle amber illumination that demands nothing of you, except that you observe it wane. The dwelling is tranquil, the yard is motionless. The darkness envelops around you like a coverlet, tender and absolute. You have performed admirably to remain with this narrative so long. You have respected these women by attending, by observing, by permitting their realities to affect you. Now release them with appreciation and compassion into the past, where they exist. They will remain there when you come back if you ever desire to visit again. But for now, there is only slumber. The coals diminish, the obscurity intensifies, your eyes grow weighted, your reflections grow gentle, your respiration comes slow and regular. You are floating now, floating toward visions, transported by the same force that transports everyone, ultimately into the blissful emptiness of repose. The Victorian darkness has concluded. A new morning will arrive, as it perpetually does, carrying illumination and potential and the opportunity to construct something superior. But that is tomorrow's endeavour. Tonight there is only this. The warmth of where you exist, the safety of this instant, the tranquility that arrives from releasing. Slumber now, slumber profoundly, slumber peacefully. The extended darkness has concluded. Pleasant visions.